Cool. Well, thanks for coming, everyone. Today, I wanted to give you guys a bit of an introduction to Cloud FinOps, and just more from like an engineering perspective, and why I think it's really important for engineers to get involved. A quick intro for myself first. So I'm Tom Cross, as you can see on the slide there. I'm a technical manager at Amach. I'm currently working with Aer Lings as a cloud infrastructure technical lead, and I'm also a member of the Technical Advisory Council for the FinOps Foundation. Before this, I worked in a cloud native managed service provider doing cost optimization and cloud resale for their customers. And before that, I was a software engineer. And that's where I kind of really developed my passion for kind of like optimizing things and making things work better than they used to. And that's kind of what got me into FinOps. So let's jump in. So before we talk about what FinOps is, I think we need to understand a bit about how the advent of cloud made FinOps necessary. So once upon a time, owning and managing your own hardware was the norm. The barrier to entry was high, and so was the cost of making mistakes if you bought the wrong stuff. This led to hardware being like massively over-provisioned, but it didn't really matter. No one really cared, because once it was paid for, nobody really worried about what it cost. You know, it was all there and running, and for the most part, the costs were stable and predictable. Finance were the gatekeepers to the kingdom, and they were living the dream. Along comes the cloud. It changes everything. All of a sudden, anyone with a credit card can get involved. It's got a much lower barrier to entry. Experimentation is cheap and low risk. And the rise of the DevOps movement that Callum was referring to earlier brought new processes and increases the pace of innovation further. But while the cloud and DevOps made it easier for companies to provision and manage their infrastructure, it created a bunch of new challenges. You know, with the ability to spin up new infrastructure on demand, it becomes increasingly difficult to keep track of your costs. Many companies, even today, find themselves with absolutely massive cloud bills from their cloud providers and no real idea where those costs are coming from. The elasticity of cloud combined with the sort of complicated billing model makes it really difficult to figure out what your costs are going to be, like predict what your costs are going to be. And this is massively stressful for finance teams, because their bread and butter is about forecasting costs. But the old approaches that they use don't work, and they find themselves in chaos. They need a new model. You know, like in some companies today, you can't even buy a €10 USB stick without filling in forms and getting approvals, but a cloud engineer can provision thousands of dollars of infrastructure without any approval, just with the click of a button. So the challenge that led to the rise of FinOps is that billing in the cloud is really hard, and most people are too far removed from it in the day-to-day to really think about how it works, and you know that ends up in pain. So understanding how the billing works in cloud, even at a high level, will give you a bit of an edge. So let's look at a bit of a simplified example for you here. Okay, so the cost for whatever service you're using is just the rate multiplied by your usage for that service in any given time period. You might be billed by the hour or by the gigabyte or some other meter, but broadly speaking, the maths is going to be just the same. If you're trying to maximize your cost efficiency, both the rate and usage can be optimized, but the levers you have available to you are going to be really different. On the rate side, it's purely financial. There's no changes to your infrastructure, but to do it effectively, you need to understand the different kinds of optimizations you can make. So there's things like committed use discounts and enterprise pricing and things like that. But the tricky bit is you can't make those kinds of commitments unless you understand what the future usage is going to look like. You need to know, like, you know, are we going to keep this application running for another 2 years before you can make a commitment? Who's going to know that? The engineers who built the stuff. That's the guys who's going to do it. So they're essential to the formula. On the usage side of the equation, it's the polar opposite. It's all engineers on this side. Every engineer has the power to influence this. Every time you make a deployment rather, you're making a financial commitment on behalf of your company. So this is the most important part of the equation, especially if you look at it from a sustainability or a waste perspective. Because if you don't need it, then 100% of that cost is going to be wasted. That puts engineers in a real position of power. And as we all know, with great power comes great responsibility. So hopefully, as you can see here, like the only way this is going to work is with collaboration. Your FinOps or your finance team or whoever's doing the rate negotiation can't do things in isolation. You know, they need to understand what the future is going to look like, whatever that might be. And on the flip side, as engineers, like it can be really challenging to optimize the usage if you don't know where the biggest spend is or where the optimization opportunities are. So a FinOps team can give you the data you need to be really laser focused on the most impactful changes that you can make as an engineer. Seems pretty straightforward, right? But the complexity lies in the scale of the billing data. So you're consuming like tens or hundreds of services across like many multiple accounts and cloud providers, and all these services are billed at like increasingly granular levels, like sometimes even down to the millisecond. And it's all this infrastructure scaling and changing and expanding all the time. All of this leads to like absolutely massive volumes of data. Like it's not uncommon to get millions or even billions of lines of data in your billing files. And you can't put it in Excel, it's just too big. So you need new tools and processes to help get the information to the people who need it as quickly as possible. So this is a bit of a kind of an intermission with a bit of a quiz, bit of interactivity just for fun. So I'm going to ask a bunch of questions and see if anyone knows some stuff. Oh, there's a hand up there already. I haven't even asked the question yet, Dan. So how much do people think was spent on public cloud in 2022 globally in dollars? Would anyone like to hazard a guess? $100 billion. That's a big number. Anyone want to go higher? 200 billion. It's actually $490 billion, which is a pretty big number, right? How much do people think the forecast for 2023 is? Any guesses? What do we think? 525 billion. That is a very precise guess. It's actually a little shy though. It's 600 billion. 600 billion is the thing, which is bigger than the GDP of Ireland. And I was doing some Googling earlier, and Google tells me there's 1.7 million houses in Ireland. If you assume that every house in Ireland was the same price as the average house in Dublin, you could buy every house in Ireland and still have plenty of change to live very well with 600 billion. So that's like a serious chunk of change. So next question. What percentage of that spend do you think is waste, like unutilized resources or over-provisioned resources? How much do you think? 15? 50. 50 is high. Wow, Jesus, we're in trouble. It's 32%, almost a third, but that's still like pretty ridiculous. Like it's disgustingly high in my view. And the last question. So, what do we think the forecast public spend is for 2025? Adrian? A trillion. It's not even close, mate. Not even close. It's 1.9 trillion. So if that trend of waste continues into 2025, there'll be more wasted in 2025 than there was spent in 2023. So like even if you don't care about the money at all, like think of the environmental cost of that. Like the cloud has already got a bigger carbon footprint than the airline industry, which is pretty crazy, right? And I personally feel that we have an obligation to use only what we need. One of the great benefits about the cost optimization side of FinOps is that it aligns really well with digital sustainability. And it seems that like cost is actually a pretty good proxy for carbon. So by helping to optimize your cloud costs, you're doing your bit for the environment and helping to reduce your carbon footprint. So it's a bit of a win-win. Okay, so what exactly do we mean when we talk about FinOps? What do we mean when we say FinOps? So the word itself is a portmanteau of finance and DevOps. And just like DevOps, as Callum was explaining earlier, it's rooted in collaboration, automation, and continuous improvement. People often equate FinOps purely with cost optimization, and there's certainly an element of that, but it goes much deeper. So let's look at the definition according to the FinOps Foundation. So FinOps is an evolving cloud financial management discipline and cultural practice that enables organizations to get maximum business value by helping engineering, finance, and business teams to collaborate on data-driven spending decisions. You can see I've added a couple of highlights in there just for things that I find interesting. And the first one, cultural practice, because this is really about changing the culture of businesses and increasing collaboration and giving teams a better way to manage their cloud spend, where everyone takes ownership of their own usage. The second highlight, maximum business value. This is about making sure that teams have this is more similar to the DevOps way that DevOps seeks to maximize efficiency of software delivery. Cost is just another metric that we can use to measure efficiency. And the more efficient we are, the greater the return we get on our investment. The last highlight, data-driven. This is about making sure that teams have the data they need, making better decisions, and understanding the trade-offs when building solutions in the cloud. If you're able to get really granular down to things like the cost per transaction or the cost per API call of your application, then you can start to see how the changes that you're making or the changes that you're wanting to making are going to affect those metrics. And you can make really objective decisions about whether a new feature or an optimization is worth the squeeze, the juice is worth the squeeze. Okay, so we've talked a bit about what we mean when we say FinOps, and I want to give you a really quick look at the FinOps framework. I've stolen this slide from the FinOps Foundation, who invented the framework. And whilst I don't have time to kind of go into it all in great detail, I just wanted to kind of give you a bit of an overview and show you that the core principles that drive FinOps. There's the personas that FinOps engage with as stakeholders, the phases, and then down the bottom there's the kind of the domains and capabilities that of activity that we perform as a FinOps practice. And I just want to kind of drill in on one bit of this, which is the phases of FinOps. So this is very similar, but a lot smaller than the DevOps lifecycle in a way. It's modeled as a continuous feedback loop where you incrementally improve your processes every time you go through the cycle. So we start on the blue section there, inform, and this is about creating visibility, providing everyone in the business with the data they need to be able to make better decisions. The second phase there is optimize. This is where we identify opportunities to optimize based on the insights from the first phase. This is basically where we build the plan. This is where we decide what we're going to do. And then the third phase, operate. This is where we execute on the plan from the optimize phase. And then we reflect on our changes before we go through the process again if we want to make any improvements. But the important thing with this cycle is not to kind of fixate on how long it takes to go through or when one phase starts and another one ends, but just to start small, get started, iterate, and start to develop that muscle memory and build trust within the teams that you're working with. Okay, so what can engineers do to support a FinOps initiative or to support sort of cost management stuff? First thing, tagging. This is probably one of the least interesting but most important things that you can do as an engineer, because it underpins so many of the other things. And you can't, especially when it comes to cost observability, because you can't manage what you can't measure. And if you can't attribute costs to your applications, then it becomes almost impossible to manage your costs, in my view. And this only gets harder as you scale. So the sooner you start, the sooner the better. If you don't already have a tagging policy, get on it. Because sit down with your colleagues and agree one. Because it's just essential. It's table stakes. I think that's what they say. So a good starting point is being able to attribute costs by whatever business unit or organizational unit your company uses, so that you can show at a high level how cost is distributed across the organization. Then you've got the kind of the workload level tags, so you can divide costs by different applications and things like that. And then lastly, the environment, so you can segregate your production and your non-production costs. So, and that's a good starting point for most people. Next bullet, resource scheduling. Automated resource scheduling is the cloud equivalent of turning off the lights when you leave the room. It's really easy to do, and switching off a development environment out of hours can save you around 75% of your run costs, so it's definitely worth investing the time in. Next up, budget alarms. Again, very, very simple to implement. All the different cloud providers have this capability out of the box pretty much. and nobody likes to be told at the end of the month that they've exceeded their budget. So have a look at historical trends for your applications, set up an alarm, and the cloud provider will send you a little alert when you're going to exceed it. It's absolute lifesaver, especially in really dynamic environments that are using lots of auto-scaling or serverless functions. Next up, we have right sizing. So yeah, optimizing for performance efficiency can deliver some really hefty savings, and it's relatively simple to do. And the last one I've got on here is just basic housekeeping. Yeah, just tidy up after yourselves. Delete resources you aren't using. Focus on efficiency and reducing waste, and spend the company's money as if it was your own. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Tom, my team's already busy. We've got sprints full of work, and now you're telling me I have to worry about costs and stuff as well. And well, yeah, I am. As we talked about already, cost is just another efficiency metric. So put it in the tool bag and get on with it. I think the engineers, the only people who understand what it costs or like what's needed to run an application. So they're in a unique position to be able to do this. Like with the adoption of cloud, the engineers hold all the power, and that's where the ownership for the spend needs to sit. You build it, you run it, you own it. So you might have heard me mention the FinOps Foundation a couple of times, but I haven't really told you anything about it. So the FinOps Foundation was started by a guy called J.R. Stormont in February 2019, who's the co-founder of Cloudability. And in 2020, they joined the Linux Foundation. They have about 10,000 members globally, continuing to grow. And their mission is advancing the people who manage the value of cloud wherever they are, which they pursue through their core objectives, which is creating connections, inspiring growth, and empowering best practices. If you're interested in finding out anything about FinOps, I strongly encourage you to go and check out their website. It's really, really good. It's got a ton of useful material on there. There's a really friendly and active Slack group in there. They have the framework that we talked about earlier, and lots of interesting other stuff. They've got working groups around cost management for containers, which is a really challenging topic if you want to get into. And they also host meetups, and they even have a Dublin chapter. So it's a really good time to get involved in that. And to round things off, I'm going to finish with my favorite FinOps quote, which is, FinOps isn't about saving money, FinOps is about making money. And for me, hearing this was a bit of a light bulb moment, because up to that point, I'd been looking at FinOps purely through the lens of cost optimization. And as I've learned since then, and hopefully I've shown a bit for you this evening, it's about much more than that. It's about empowering engineers to make better decisions that drive business value, creating a culture of accountability and ownership across teams where everyone understands the impact of their work. Remember, the best way to save money on cloud is not to spend it in the first place. Be ruthless about hunting down and eliminating waste. In this way, I think that FinOps is the best hope for starting to address some of the massive waste that our industry is responsible for, and being a little bit more sustainable. Hooray! And that's me. So I've got a couple of calls to action. So if any of this has been interesting to you, go and educate yourself, find out a bit more about FinOps, join the community, and then the second one there, be curious, ask all the questions, speak to the people in your own companies, find out how they're managing their cloud spend, if they are, and how much pain they're in, and maybe you can help them. And that's me. If anyone's got any questions, fire away. Or we can just get straight to the beer and pizza, which works for me too.
I suppose more an observation than a question, but I came from an AWS event today,
okay,
where there's a big push on towards sort of serverless stuff, which pushes you in the direction of much more of their managed services and whatnot. And it all sounds great in terms of scaling to zero and stuff not being used, but it's not necessarily priced then appropriately. They'll seek a premium for serverless stuff because they need to make a return on it.
They do, yeah, but yeah. You're only paying for it when it's running. So, but you pay a small premium for the fact that it's fully managed and stuff. But generally speaking, unless you're using unless it's something that's getting hammered all the time, if you've got a serverless thing that's running 24/7, you're going to be paying through the nose for that. So you're using something like Fargate in AWS. that would be far better running on EC2, because it just doesn't make sense to run something serverless if it's running 24/7, unless you just don't want the hassle of running the like managing the infrastructure, I guess.
Yeah.
But there's a trade-off there. So you can either pay someone to manage the infrastructure for you, or pay AWS to do it. It depends how big your team is.
But in terms of, let's say, bang for your buck to try and get all these workloads working more efficiently, there's, I don't know, you could have more drive behind people changing their architectural practices.
Yeah, so architectural changes are probably the most challenging part of FinOps, because like people can be quite wedded to the way that they like to do something, and it can be difficult to. It can be more expensive from an engineering perspective to implement infrastructure like architectural changes than it's not just like right sizing an instance or like turning stuff off at the weekends. It's a bit more hardcore. So you really have to be able to understand like the sort of the total cost of something, including the engineering effort and the onward costs of managing it to really get into that, which is a bit more challenging.
Thanks.
Good question though, thank you.
So does FinOps encourages multi-cloud approach? So because of the different prices of the cloud providers?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, the FinOps is pretty cloud agnostic. It does get more challenging when you're running multi-cloud, but in my view, and I think in the view of quite a lot of people that I speak to in the FinOps community, like trying to hop around between cloud providers, chasing the best rates, is a fool's errand. Like you end up losing out on a lot of the sort of the functionality that's baked into your cloud platform, and you generalize something so that it'll run in any cloud. You kind of lose. It's like a race to the bottom in terms of feature sets. You end up spending more effort in building a thing and trying to get it hopping around between the clouds than you would have saved if you just had it running in one place in the first place. But it's an important factor to think of when you're like first going into the cloud. If you don't have a cloud footprint already, like understanding what the different cloud providers can bring to the table and what the different pricing model is important.
You said effort there, Tom. Do you think the effort to keep things optimized will always be greater than the waste? Greater than waste?
I don't know. Like I think if you're tracking waste as a metric, then like as long as it's kind of prioritized alongside all the other things, like especially if you're getting into kind of like the unit economic stuff that I was kind of mentioning before, like looking at the cost per API call or the cost per like action within your system. Like if that's a kind of key KPI for a team, then it just becomes like naturally prioritized as part of the work. So if there's a new feature being built and it's going to double the cost per transaction in your system, then you can go back to the business and say like, this is going to have a real big cost impact. Do we really want to do this, or is there a different way we can build this? But it means that you're making that decision at the beginning of the process, rather than building the whole thing and going, oh shit, we're spending double what we were last month. What are we going to do about it? It's kind of starting with cost in mind. Shift left. Yeah. More shifting left. Anyone else? Grand. In that case, I think it's beer o'clock. Thank you very much indeed for coming.